Hello, welcome back. I am so happy to see you here again. I am glad you prefer my voice to listen, the Headspace Guide to Meditation and Mindfulness. If you are enjoying my voice, please don't forget to subscribe. If you are ready, let's continue with episode 3. As it happens, the restroom was busy, and so, with no urinals free, I went into one of the cubicles. I won't go into detail, but these toilets had seen better days, and whoever had used it beforehand had forgotten to flush. I was still lost in thought and worry as I stood there and lifted up my robes. And then it happened. Before I could do anything, I watched in horror as $500 in loose notes fell into the pan. Needless to say, had I been more mindful and less caught up in all the thoughts, it would simply never have happened. I got distracted. And when you get distracted, you make mistakes. You may be wondering what happened next. Did I really leave $500 floating in the toilet? Or did I roll up my sleeves and do the unthinkable? Let's just say I ended up going on that retreat. So mindfulness means to be present. It means being in the moment, experiencing life directly as it unfolds, rather than being distracted, caught up and lost in thought. It's not a contrived or temporary state of mind that you need to somehow create and maintain. On the contrary, it's a way of stepping back and resting the mind in its natural state, free from the usual chaos. Take a moment to imagine what it might be like to live life this way. Imagine how it would be to drop all the baggage, the stories, the arguments, the judgments and agendas that take up so much space in the mind. This is what it means to be mindful. But after a lifetime of being lost in thought, the right kind of conditions are needed in order to learn how to step back in this way. That's where meditation comes in. There's nothing mystical about it. Meditation is simply a technique to provide you with the optimum conditions for practicing the skill of mindfulness. Of course, you can experience being in the moment or fully absorbed in the present with any activity, not just with the practice of meditation. In fact, you'll have no doubt experienced this feeling many times in your life before. Perhaps you were skiing down a mountain, riding a bike, listening to your favorite bit of music, playing with your child, or even watching a sunset. The problem with this approach is it tends to be a bit hit and miss, and so we don't get to experience the feeling all that often. But by sitting down to meditate each day, even if it's for a very short time, that feeling of being present, aware, and in the moment becomes increasingly familiar and is then that much easier to apply to the rest of your life. As with learning any new skill, if you want to get the very best out of it, you need to provide yourself with the very best conditions in which to learn. In fact, the practice of meditation provides such good conditions for learning mindfulness that for many that's as far as they want to take it. Simply having 10 minutes of resting the mind each day can feel like enough. The idea of mindfulness and meditation and how they relate is not necessarily that easy to grasp. So try thinking of it this way. Imagine you're learning to drive a car. Presumably you'd head out to a quiet country road rather than a busy motorway at first. Of course you can drive on either, but one is much easier than the other when you're learning. The same is true of mindfulness. You can use it in any situation and for any purpose, but the easiest place to learn the skill of mindfulness is during meditation. The funny thing is, even when you feel confident in applying mindfulness to everyday life, you'll probably still want to take a short time out to meditate each day. That's because no matter how good a driver you might be, there's something comforting and even exhilarating about driving along a quiet country road that a motorway never can quite match. What's more, it also gives you the time and space to notice what's going on around you, to admire the scenery. The distinction between meditation and mindfulness may not sound that important, and often the words are used interchangeably. But unless you're about to pack your bags and start life afresh as a monk or a nun, this distinction matters a lot. Because so long as you're living life outside of a mountain retreat, there'll always be a limited amount of time to sit down and practice meditation in a formal, structured way. Often I hear people saying, I don't have time to meditate, I'm too busy, I've got too much to do, I'm too stressed. But if we look at the broader context, in terms of training and cultivating the mind no matter where we are or what we're doing, then suddenly it starts to look more achievable. At the very least, it sounds more compatible with all the responsibilities and commitments of modern-day living. And that's what will hopefully make this book such an invaluable guide for you. It will show you how you can continue to live in the world with a daily meditation practice bite-sized enough to fit into your schedule, yet long enough to make a difference. It will also show you how you can use this broader idea of mind training or mindfulness to transform your experience of everyday life. I'm sure there'll be some seasoned meditators who'll throw their hands up in horror at the idea of a 10-minute meditation. If you're one of them, then at first glance I appreciate this may sound like the equivalent of a ready-cooked microwavable meal. But examine the intentions of mind training a little more closely, and you'll see that the idea of little and often makes a great deal of sense. We need to be flexible, adaptive, and responsive in our approach to meditation. It's all well and good to sit perfectly still for an hour, but if you're unable to maintain your awareness for all that time, then little benefit will come from it. And what about the other 23 hours of the day? Like so many things in life, when it comes to meditation, it's about quality rather than quantity. Start by taking just 10 minutes. If you find it easy, want to do more, and have the time, then great. But there are still many benefits to be had from simply sitting for 10 minutes a day. Even if I ignore all the anecdotal benefits that I've heard and seen over the years, there's now substantial scientific evidence, which you'll notice throughout the book, to support the health benefits of short, regular, daily meditation sessions. What is Headspace? If mindfulness is the ability to be present, to rest in the moment whatever you're doing, and meditation is the best way of learning that skill, then Headspace could be considered the outcome. I'm using the word in the broadest possible context here. In fact, many people might choose to use the word happiness instead. The problem with the word happiness is it tends to get confused with the emotion of happiness. Don't get me wrong, having fun, enjoying yourself, laughing and smiling are wonderful aspects of life. Who wouldn't want to experience more of these things? But life's not continually like that. Stuff happens. And that stuff is not always nice. As much as we try to ignore the fact, life can be difficult, stressful, upsetting, and even painful at times. So the type of happiness that just comes and goes dependent on our circumstances and mood is too temporary, too unstable, to offer us any lasting sense of calm or clarity. That's why I prefer the word headspace. It describes an underlying sense of peace, a feeling of fulfillment or unshakable contentment, no matter what emotion might be in play at that time. Headspace is not a quality of mind dependent on surface emotions. This means it can be experienced just as clearly in periods of sadness or anger as it can in times of excitement and laughter. Essentially, it's being okay with whatever thoughts you're experiencing or emotions you're feeling. That's why meditation feels so good, often even the very first time. It doesn't necessarily leave you rolling around in laughter or swinging from the chandeliers, but it leaves you with the sense of having touched upon that underlying sense of contentment, that place where you just know that everything is okay. The consequences of this can be life-changing. This distinction between headspace and the emotion of happiness is an important one. For some reason, we've come to believe that happiness should be the default setting in life, and therefore anything different is somehow wrong. Based on this assumption, we tend to resist the source of unhappiness, physically, mentally, and emotionally. It's usually at this stage that things get complicated. Life can begin to feel like a chore, and an endless struggle to chase and maintain that feeling of happiness. We get hooked on the temporary rush or pleasure of a new experience, whatever that is, and then need to feed it the whole time. It doesn't matter whether we feed it with food, drink, drugs, clothes, cars, relationships, work, or even the peace and quiet of the countryside. If we become dependent on it for our happiness, then we're trapped. What happens when we can't have it anymore? And what happens when the excitement wears off? For many, their entire life revolves around this pursuit of happiness. Yet how many people do you know who are truly happy? And by that I mean, how many people do you know who have that unshakable sense of underlying headspace? Has this approach of chasing one thing after the next worked for you in terms of giving you headspace? It's as if we rush around creating all this mental chatter in our pursuit of temporary happiness, without realizing that all the noise is simply drowning out the natural headspace that is already there, just waiting to be acknowledged. During my travels in India, I met with a man called Joshi. He was one of those people who is instantly likable. He started talking to me as I was waiting for a bus one day. As anyone who's been to India will tell you, that can be a long wait, especially in the mountains. We got on well and had a few mutual interests, the most notable being meditation. Over the next few weeks, we spent more time talking and sharing our experiences. Each day, Joshi weaved into the conversation just a little bit more about his life. A few years before we met, Joshi had lived with his wife and 4 children. Because neither his parents or in-laws were particularly wealthy, they also lived with the family. Joshi said that although it had been a very crowded house back then, it had also been a very happy one. But not long after his wife had returned to work, having had their 4th baby, she was tragically killed in a road accident. Her parents and her newborn child were with her in the car at the time. It was a very serious accident, and there were no survivors. As I think back to Joshi telling me this story, it still brings tears to my eyes. He said that the pain had been unbearable, that he hadn't been able to face the world, that all he wanted to do was to retreat within himself and hide away at home. But his parents reminded him that he still had 3 children who needed his care and support, and that what they needed most of all was a father who was there for them. So Joshi threw himself into looking after the children and giving them his undivided attention whenever he could. A few months later, the monsoon arrived, and with it came the typical floods in that region of the country. As a result, there was a lot of standing water in the area, and the incidence of disease shot up dramatically. Along with many other children in the village, Joshi's children got very ill. His mother also became unwell. Within 2 weeks, all 3 children and his mother had died. His mother had been weak beforehand and passed away quickly. The children had been stronger, but not so strong that they could fight off the illness. Within 3 short months, this one man had lost his wife, his mother, his children, and his in-laws. His father was the only survivor in his entire family. Unable to live in the same house that had witnessed so much tragedy, Joshi went to stay with his friends. His father, unable to leave the house that he had always called home, remained to look after it. Within just a few days of moving, Joshi received the news that his house had burned down, with his father seemingly trapped inside. Joshi said he still wasn't sure whether it had been an accident or whether his father had decided that he was simply unable to go on. As I heard this story unfold, I felt increasingly ashamed of my grumbling, moaning, and complaining in life, of always wanting things to be exactly as I wanted them to be, and not being satisfied unless I got my way. How could I get so upset about the train being late, or being woken up in the middle of the night, or a disagreement with a friend? Here was a man who had suffered in a way that I could only ever imagine, and yet who still seemed to have this extraordinary sense of calm and presence about him. I asked him what he'd done since losing his family, and he described how he'd moved to this new area. He said that having no family, no home, and no money had forced him to think very differently about life. In the end, he'd chosen to live in a meditation center where he spent most of his time. I asked whether he thought that his time spent meditating had changed the way he felt about what had happened. He replied that it hadn't changed the way he felt, but had instead changed his experience of those feelings. He said that while he still felt a great sense of loss and sadness at times, he perceived it differently. He described how he'd found a place beneath those thoughts and feelings where there was a sense of peace, of stillness, and of calm. He said that it was the one thing that could never be taken away from him, that no matter what else happened to him in life, he would always have this place within himself to return to. While this may be an extreme example, life will inevitably serve up challenges for all of us, situations we wish were different or would prefer to be otherwise, although hopefully none so tragic as the story of Joshi. Meditation can't change that, nor can anything else for that matter. It's part of being human, of living in this world. Sometimes there'll be external situations that require change, that might even demand change, and you'll need to handle these situations skillfully, with mindfulness. But when it comes to the way you think and feel about those situations, the starting point is to acknowledge that it's the mind itself that defines your experience. This is why training the mind is so important. By changing the way in which you see the world, you effectively change the world around you. I think often this point is misunderstood, and people feel as though they have to give up their dreams and ambitions in life in order to practice meditation. But that's not the case at all. There is something inherently human about striving to achieve something, and having a sense of purpose and direction in life is vital. But, if anything, meditation can be used to clarify and support that purpose, because what the practice will show you, in a very direct way, is that a lasting sense of happiness and sense of headspace is not dependent on these things. This will allow you to live with a greater sense of freedom and ease, confident in where you're heading in life, and yet not so attached to the outcome that an unexpected obstacle or unfavorable outcome will result in heartbreak and loss. It is a subtle yet profound shift in perspective. The need for headspace. When was the last time you sat down, completely still, undistracted and undisturbed, with no television, music, books, magazines, food, drink, phone, computer, friends, family, or something you needed to think about or resolve in your own mind? If you've never looked at anything like meditation before, then my guess is probably never. Because usually, even if we're just lying in bed, we still tend to be involved in the thought process. So for many people, the idea of doing absolutely nothing sounds at best boring and at worst positively frightening. In fact, we're so busy doing stuff the whole time that we no longer have any reference point for what it means to be still, simply resting the mind. We've become addicted to doing stuff, even if it's just thinking. So it's not surprising that sitting still without distractions can feel a little alien at first. Exercise 1. Not doing try it now. Without moving from where you're sitting, just close the book and place it in your lap. You don't need to sit in any particular way, but just gently close your eyes and sit for a minute or two. It's no problem if lots of thoughts pop up. You can let them come and go for now, but see what it feels like to sit still, not doing anything, for just a minute or two. How was it? Perhaps it felt very relaxing to do nothing. Or perhaps you felt the need to do something, even if it was doing something within the exercise itself. Maybe you felt the urge to focus on something, to keep yourself occupied in some way. Don't worry, it's not a test, and there'll be plenty to keep you occupied when we get onto the meditation in the next section. But I think there's something beneficial, even at this early stage, in noticing the habit or desire to do something the whole time. If you didn't experience the urge to do something, then you might like to try the exercise again, but this time for a few minutes longer. Now I'm not suggesting that there's anything wrong with watching television, listening to music, having a drink, going shopping, or hanging out with friends. On the contrary, these are all things to be enjoyed. It's just useful to recognize that they facilitate a certain amount of temporary happiness rather than a lasting sense of headspace. Have you ever finished work for the day feeling really strung out with a busy mind? Perhaps you decided to just switch off for the evening and watch a bit of television to make yourself feel better. If the program was really good and you were fully distracted, then it might have felt as though it gave you a break from all those thoughts. But if it was not very interesting, or had lots of ads, it will probably have created just enough space for those thoughts to arise every now and then. Either way, when the program finished, there's a pretty good chance that all those thoughts and feelings will have flooded back again. Sure, they may not have come back with the same intensity, but they are likely to have been there in the background nonetheless. And this is how most people live their lives, moving from one distraction to the next. When they're at work, they're too busy, too distracted, to be aware of how they really feel. So when they get home, they're suddenly confronted by lots of thoughts. If they manage to keep themselves occupied during the evening, then they may not even become aware of these thoughts until they go to bed at night. You know how it goes. You put your head on the pillow and it appears as though the mind suddenly goes into overdrive. Of course, the thoughts have been there all along. It's just that without any distractions, you become aware of them. Or it can be the other way around. Some people have such busy social lives or family lives that it's not until they get to work that they become aware of just how frazzled they feel, of all the thoughts racing around in the mind. All these distractions affect our ability to concentrate, perform, and live at anywhere near our optimum level. Needless to say, if the mind is always racing from one thought to the next, then our ability to focus will be seriously impaired. Exercise 2. The senses. Take another 2 minutes to do this short exercise. As before, stay sitting exactly as you are right now. After putting the book down in your lap, gently focus on one of the physical senses, preferably sound or sight at this stage. I'd recommend using background sounds and closing your eyes, but as sounds can be a little unpredictable at times, you might prefer to keep your eyes open and gaze at a particular object in the room instead, or perhaps a point on the wall. Whichever sense you choose, try focusing on it for as long as possible, but in a very light and easy way. If you get distracted by thoughts or other physical senses, simply bring your attention back to the object of focus and continue as before. How did you find it? Were you able to focus on it quite easily, or did you find your mind kept wandering off with other thoughts? How long did it take before you got distracted? Maybe you found you were able to maintain a vague sense of awareness, but were thinking about other things at the same time. As unlikely as it may sound, for many people focusing on an object for even 1 minute is quite an achievement. When you think how long you need to focus on your work, or looking after your family, perhaps listening to a friend or even driving a car, only being able to focus for such a short period of time can be quite a worry.